We don't have a data shortage when it comes to our narrators. The narrators for whom we lack data are called unknown narrators. We see taking a risk on them as a sign of weakness. Some may be trustworthy among them. Through textual analysis, we conclude they are reliable. Still, we don't take that risk and transmit narrations from them. We say, Hadith scholars don't seek infallible narrators. There's no such thing. There are flaws later systematized, called meta and asara, meaning flaws that cause us to abandon or criticize a narrator. One of these is su'ai hifz, which means poor memory. For example, we say this here, it's not that they never make mistakes, but that their mistakes outnumber their correct narrations. Here's how I see it. Is the narration of an unreliable narrator worth our effort? That's my perspective. There's also another issue. Let's say, for argument's sake, we consider all of them. So what do we do in case of a contradiction? E.g., the weak narrator's account differs from the reliable narrator's, but gives more details. What should we do in this situation?
Istanbul. Hello to everyone from Oculo. Dear viewers, today we will talk about the science of hadith and the issue of the reliability of hadiths. Our guest is Associate Professor Dr. Fatma Kızıl. Welcome, Professor Lam. How are you?
I'm well.
And you are well too. Thank you much. Professor, today we want to talk about the science of hadith. We want to address the issue of the reliability of hadiths because it's a topic that's widely debated. How can we trust hadiths and what methods should we follow to trust them? We actually want to start with these questions. How can we trust hadiths? If you like, let's start this way. How is the reliability of hadiths determined? What do you think?
As you mentioned, determining hadith reliability plays a central role in Muslim lives. For the Quran's authenticity, there is no debate in anyone's mind. That's why all our issues and debates revolve around hadiths. The separation of schools of thought, like modernists and others, is also based on this. These are the traditionalists. Again, their approach is also based on hadiths. So the reliability of hadiths is truly an important issue. But here we need to make a distinction. We make the same distinction in almost every field of Islamic sciences. For those who don't have a background in Islamic sciences, how can they determine the reliability of hadiths? Those with a background in Islamic sciences, well, just an undergraduate degree isn't enough, but they know the theory of hadith criticism and have practiced its application. How do these people approach the issue? I think it's important to separate these two groups. Expecting professional-level hadith criticism from people without a background in Islamic sciences is unreasonable. This is the most important problem we face today.
Yes, actually, both sides criticize each other. I mean, those who are formally educated provide one type of criticism, as if to say, we're the experts in this field. But those who come from a madrasa background or have gone through a different traditional education method also criticize in their own way. Both sides actually have, different perspectives toward each other.
Actually, I can understand this. For example, those with a madrasa education may have studied classical hadith methodology. But classical hadith criticism isn't something that can be done just by studying methodology, because methodology gives you the rules and terms. That's the theory, but when you get to practice, there are details. We usually include this under the heading of the science of hidden defects. Or it doesn't necessarily have to be related to a hidden defect, but there are certain experiences you gain during practice. Hadith scholars even call this malik. They also make a very nice analogy. We always tell this to our students. They compare good hadith scholars to money changers. It's like this. It's about being able to tell in a glance if something is gold or not. Otherwise, it's not just about the methodology. That's why I said not only students from madrasas, but even those who graduated from theology faculties, I warn my own students too, shouldn't think they can criticize hadiths on their own. There are stages to this: hadith extraction, hadith analysis. I'm at this stage now, doing meta-analysis of hadith isnads. In other words, I'm engaged in hadith criticism. Even so, when someone asks me a question about a hadith, I still say that I need to research it first. That's why I make this distinction between the two. But that doesn't mean this. So, does it mean that someone who hasn't studied theology, or someone who has but not sufficiently, won't have any opinion about hadiths? Of course they will, but my suggestion, was to study hadiths with traditional teachers the old-fashioned way. Today, maybe that's not very possible, but now, like here, you can access many lessons through social media channels and YouTube. But aside from that, academics are already putting in serious effort when it comes to hadiths. For example, there's a project called Islam with Hadiths where many academics are involved and working together. This project collects authentic, reliable hadiths that relate to almost every aspect of life. You can refer to these kinds of sources. Sometimes, yes, religion is a field that belongs to all of us. There's a side needing expertise. I don't mean to sound condescending. My point is this. For example, like you can't say, this medicine worked for me, so you should take it when a doctor prescribes you something, right? Everyone has their own specific conditions. It's the same with Islamic jurisprudence, and it's the same with hadiths. Each one needs to be evaluated independently. That's why I recommend turning to hadith scholars or the books they've written. But if you ask, how do we determine the reliability of a hadith? What process do we follow as hadith scholars? In fact, we do similar things to what a hadith scholar in the 2nd century would do. What we do is, when we're asked about a hadith, we gather all the sources in which that hadith appears. We collect all the sources, and ultimately, we create a genealogy of the hadith. We call this an isnad diagram. It's kind of like a tree, so to speak. Who has transmitted this hadith from the Prophet up to today? But we don't stop there. Then, we have biographical information about these transmitters.
So we've actually moved on to a second stage. Here, the issue of the reliability of the narrators.
The narrator's reliability is crucial. It's directly tied to the reliability of the hadith. We can't just do this, open a hadith or a book and think the text sounds nice. There are many such narrations circulating on social media. Our master said the Prophet did the following. These are very risky. Because just because the content of a saying is beautiful doesn't mean the Prophet actually said it. What matters to us is the chain of narrators between us and the Prophet. How many people have transmitted this? In each generation, by generation, I mean the companions, their students, and the students after them. Are these people trustworthy? What is their involvement with hadith? Sometimes this happens. So, how do you find this information? It seems strange to people, but that's what a hadith scholar examines. Many works began to be compiled from a very early period, and we have this information about the narrators. So, we don't have a shortage of data. Look, I think this is very important. Generally, people might not know this. We don't have a lack of data about the narrators. The only narrators we lack data on are those we call unknown narrators. We don't take risks with them anyway. We consider them weak. Look, maybe there could be trustworthy narrators among them, and in fact, text analyses often show that they are generally reliable. We don't take that risk and we don't accept narrations from them.
Now, I'd like to ask you for a comparison here. Professor, there was an issue we discussed in our previous episodes, like the holistic approach method. We talked about this with Professor Mehmet Apaydın. Right now, you're talking about a different method. Of course, I'm not saying which method is more correct or anything like that. The method used there wasn't about whether all the narrators or all the hadiths were authentic or narrated, etc., but rather about considering all of them and creating a sense of wholeness based on those that have a degree of truth. You, on the other hand, argue that we shouldn't take risks and that all unreliable ones should be completely filtered out, and we should continue only with the reliable ones. What kind of difference do you see between these two methods?
So, I understand what the professor is trying to do. As you said, one is superior to the other. This method I mentioned, we also call it the method of opposition, gathering the chains of transmission, comparing the texts, bringing them together. But we don't stop there. Then we rely on information in narrators' biographies. The professor, regarding narrator biographies, separates narrators, those abandoned, meaning whose hadiths we don't accept, weak narrators, reliable narrators. He does not favor these distinctions. As you said, he prefers to collect all narrations. Here's the issue: just because a narrator is weak, and let me say, we don't reject every weak narrator. There are degrees of weakness. I tell students the science of hadith is about degrees. We classify hadiths in degrees, and we classify narrators in degrees. We classify the terms in isnad analysis into degrees, then decide by subject. For example, we don't accept hadiths from weak narrators on obligatory acts or halal and haram, but might for daily life topics. Some are never accepted, so it's always a...
So the topics are also graded.
Exactly. Oh, I understand, my teacher, but here's how I see it. Does a narration from an unreliable narrator really have any value for our work? That's how I look at it. And there's another problem. Let's say we take all of them into account. So what do we do in case of a contradiction? So let's say the narration from this weak narrator contradicts the narrations from reliable narrators. But the narration from the weak narrator contains more information. What do we do in that case? Honestly, I don't know what approach the teacher would take in that situation. But for us, it's like this. It's the same in daily life, too. I mean, I give my students this kind of example. For example, you go into class and everyone is taking notes. When it's time for the midterm, they compare notes. And there's one student who always stands out. They've written less or written things incorrectly. No, that's not what was said. The other students differ from this one, and this keeps happening over and over. Now, as a result of this experience, by the third or fourth semester, you stop taking notes from that student. That's how it is. Hadith scholars do the same thing. They listen to hadiths from a student repeatedly at different times. They also listen to the same hadith from other students who learned it from the same teacher and compare them. In other words, those weak judgments aren't given arbitrarily. In fact, what we do today is the same process that was applied to those narrators, because they consistently stood out from their peers or made certain mistakes in their daily lives. So, are the texts of weak narrators really worth all that effort? I have some doubts about this issue. Secondly, when I do these isnad and text analyses, here's what I see. Sometimes narrators recall unknown or weak, for example, transmit from a teacher along with 4 of their peers, and when you compare their texts with those of the other 4 students, there are many cases where they are largely similar. The teacher probably makes these statements by taking such situations into account, but still, the science of Rigel acts cautiously and, if the narrator is unknown, does not accept his hadith. So there is a margin of caution here. Because religion is very important, let me explain how the teacher's idea could work. To consider narrations from weak narrators as suggested, I think we need something like this. But we don't have such a study yet. We need a system where all the narrations of a narrator are examined and compared with the narrations of other narrators who transmit the same hadith, that is, the people who transmit hadiths. We will do this, and then maybe we will assign a reliability coefficient to those narrators. Hamis Agdemir Hoka mentioned this in some of his works, but it hasn't been put into practice. Because this is a large-scale project, it requires collaboration between software developers and hadith scholars. As I mentioned, that unknown narrator aligns with the other 4 narrators in my example. If this pattern is in all his narrations, even without enough information about him, we can say we may not know much about him, but he is clearly reliable. But right now, we don't have such data. I also see it as risky to do this based on individual hadiths.
Since we haven't reached that kind of method yet, maybe because we don't have that kind of technology either.
No collaboration between software developers and hadith scholars. I mean, some small-scale studies have started with artificial intelligence.
Yes.
But we're not at that level yet. We don't have an encyclopedia of narrators or one that compares their texts. However, if we decide about narrators at this level and can determine that weak narrators actually align with the trustworthy Sikh narrators despite being considered weak, then maybe that holistic approach Mehmet Hoka mentioned could come into play, meaning we could also include the hadiths of weak narrators. But the instinct of hadith scholars is to proceed based on trustworthy narrators.
Now, you mentioned stages here. We're looking for consistency. And you also talked about whether the person, the narrator, is trustworthy in their personal life and about the margin of error.
Yes.
So we're actually talking about people, and every person has a margin of error, really. How is the boundary maintained here?
Very good. Hadith scholars don't expect narrators to be flawless. Such people don't exist. There are flaws that later became systematized, which we call mataya nesra. These are flaws that cause us to abandon or criticize a narrator. This is besuai hifz, for nanway. For example, we say this here. It's not that they never make mistakes, but that their mistakes outnumber their correct narrations. Otherwise, Hadith scholars accept that narrators can make mistakes. In fact, we have specific terms for this. For example, we have a term shah. This means a trustworthy narrator contradicts others who are even more reliable or contradicts many narrators. So, we do not accept this hadith even if the narrator is trustworthy. So, we acknowledge that even trustworthy narrators can make mistakes, forget, or sometimes mix up their narrations. I think there's a problem here. I don't know if we're not explaining the stages of Hadith science correctly, or if we're not conveying it to the public well enough. People think we pass judgment on Hadiths too easily, but that's really not the case. I mean, our examination of narrators is very detailed. Even if a narrator is considered trustworthy, even if a Hadith meets all the conditions, we don't immediately declare it authentic. We look at whether it aligns with the Sunnah. Well, for example, there is a science we call progress that I just mentioned. We know that even if a hadith appears authentic on the surface, it can still have hidden flaws. So I think one reason why hadith scholars tend to react so strongly in debates about hadith is this. Since we're aware of all these stages, scholars naturally develop a reflex against people who criticize and reject hadiths too easily. But I truly believe it's a meticulous science. I'm not saying they're hadith merchants, but I do think it's a rigorous field of study.
Yes, Professor, especially from the public's perspective, you have a long and challenging path, but it doesn't really come across that way to the general public. I'm including myself in that group as well. I'm not a theologian either, because my field is philosophy as well. When we look at the science of hadith, your method of examination, that long journey, and your challenging process aren't really understood. Maybe if you talk more about this process, it could become clearer. As you said, it's not just about simply separating this is an authentic hadith, this isn't, and moving on. The reliability of the narrator and the hadith itself goes through many stages. If you talk more on these stages, we can clarify.
The first thing we do is gather all sources where a hadith appears. The scholars of the 2nd century gathered the narrations from every narrator who transmitted a hadith. It's the same process. The only difference is the resources we have. We collect all the narrations, and we conduct 2 types of research about the narrators. How trustworthy are they in their religious lives? Do they commit major sins? There is data about these matters. Today, when we look at someone, whether they perform prayers, who they associate with, it may seem odd to record such information. But in works from the 2nd century, we also find data about the religious lives of narrators. Which sects they were affiliated with, you can think of it like today's communities. So, who did they associate with? Who did they spend time with? Which groups did they belong to? How did they approach religious matters? There is information about their religious integrity, like whether they pray regularly, justice, and if the person has ever lied in daily life. Are they trustworthy, for example? And then there's the issue of retention. This is a matter of scholarly competence. In other words, do they have the capacity to properly understand what they read or hear? So, how long can they retain what they've memorized? If you're wondering how they determine this, they listen to the hadith from the narrator again at different times, or the narrator might have written down the hadith. How well do they preserve their written material? Do they lend it to others? We have info on these things, specifics like this. In biographical, Rigel literature, someone traveled to a city. When he went to that city, he didn't have his books, so the hadiths narrated by those who heard him there are less reliable.
That's a very subtle point, yes.
If we don't know these details about a narrator's life, if we don't know such details, we call that narrator unknown. As I mentioned, we don't accept narrations from those narrators. Generally, unknown narrators are the minority, and we do have this information about most narrators' lives. We don't just stop there either. I mean, we have this kind of information about the narrator's reliability as well. Even that isn't enough for us. We also compare narrations from different narrators. For example, they listen to the same teacher in the same gathering. Do they report the same? If someone constantly gives incomplete information, we understand there's a problem with their memory. Or if someone always contradicts their peers, we take it as an issue with their memory. On the other hand, if someone consistently narrates in line with the majority, that shows their memory is good. All these are ways we use to assess the reliability of narrators. And this is important. What makes a hadith is its chain of transmission, the isnad. When you open a book of hadith, you'll see two things. The hadith is divided into two parts, names, and beneath them, the text. What we call the text is the words of the Prophet, his actions, or whatever it may be. But the names are the people who transmitted it, starting from the Prophet and the generation of the companions. This is also one of the topics we investigate. Were these people really in contact with each other? We call this irsa. In other words, did they actually meet each other? Were they present in the same gathering? For this, we look at certain data. Where were they born? Which cities did they visit? In which years did they pass away?
In fact, a time and place analysis is also needed. It has now turned into a more comprehensive situation. Which era did they live in? In which year did they live? In what place were they born and raised? It's like trying to analyze that entire period to see it from a bird's eye view.
Hadith scholars are also historians. As Ibn Hajar says, every hadith scholar is a historian, but not every historian is a hadith scholar. But a hadith scholar has to be a historian. As you said, in that era, for example, how could a narrator who has never left Basra transmit from a teacher who has never left Medina? When we have this data, we understand that there is a missing narrator in between. And as soon as the narrator is missing, if we think of it like a tree, if there is a break in that tree and it has been grafted, we notice that light. 2. A narrator is here who shouldn't be present, like a graft has been made.
It seems like a delicate, meticulously studied subject, Professor. Well, one of the things that isn't really understood when you think about it now is how, in the traditional period, such detailed notes were kept. So many notes about a person's daily life and living practices were recorded and passed down, and that's something to consider. And by continuing that chain, right now, while researching, we're also using modern methods at the same time. So we're benefiting from both the traditional and using modern methods. How do you see the connection between these two? How do you evaluate this relationship?
Well, actually, instead of saying modern methods, maybe it's more accurate to say modern tools. The material still comes to us from the classical literature. Because, well, there's something called text mining, or data mining. The data for this is already available. We have volumes and volumes of books, our biographical literature, and hadith texts. And recently, well, for example, when I was doing my PhD, I didn't quite catch that period. In the past, our professors used to access hadiths through indexes, and those indexes generally started to be prepared from the 19th century onward. In other words, starting from a particular word, you could find the sources where a hadith appeared, but not all sources. Usually it was limited to the Kitab al-Tizay. Now, with computer programs, we can actually access all the sources where a hadith appears in maybe half an hour. There's a program called Shamila, there's Jami, and there's Kadam al-Haramain. There's also a program that Professor Mehmet Hipaydan, whom you mentioned earlier regarding the holistic approach, developed himself. Right now, we don't have any problems accessing hadiths or data about the narrators. The issue is analyzing this data correctly and maybe approaching this data with certain questions. For example, as we mentioned earlier, it could be something like creating a narrator database, or there could be words that are frequently repeated in the Prophet's hadiths. There could be patterns in the hadiths. There could be words that are rarely used. There could be unusual words. These are things we can access through digital means. I can say that studies in this field have slowly started to be conducted.
And actually, one of these studies is your own work. If we touch on this a bit, Professor, what do you think about the contribution of your own work to the science of hadith?
Now, my work has two main aspects: Orientalism and Isnad text analysis. Orientalism is a separate issue. Regarding that, I tried to respond to the claims of Orientalists about the hadith literature. I tried to show that Orientalists, like us, come from a certain tradition, and that the tradition they come from and belong to affects their understanding of hadiths. and that Orientalists actually operate based on certain premises. That was the Orientalism aspect of the work. And I also tried to respond to the Orientalists through isnad text analysis. What I was trying to do is this: Orientalists generally approach hadiths in a way that's related to the skepticism we mentioned earlier about hadith. They tended to portray the transmission process as mostly a fictional process full of fabrications. By conducting isnad text analysis, I think I've shown that it's not actually that easy to just make up an isnad and immediately attach a text to it. There were also people who did this within the Orientalist paradigm. But I believe I responded by doing isnad text analysis using our own terms and concepts. I hope that's the case.
It is, Professor. Thank you very much for your valuable comments and for your work. We also really appreciate your contribution to this field.
Thank you much.
Dear viewers, today we talked about the science of hadith and its reliability. See you in the next episode. Goodbye.